Okay friends, it's time to start our job. One of the first things we have to do is safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so the wheel's off the ground. After that, we're going to remove our lug nuts. Remove your wheel. With the wheel off of here, the next thing I want to do is remove this bolt for our ABS wire. Now we'll just come up here, get a little bit more slack from the ABS wire. Now we'll follow it up over here. Follow it this way. You should find that it's clipped on the back side of this. Ours isn't actually on there because it's broken. Next thing I want to do is squeeze this little tab right here and separate this. Inspect both areas, make sure that they're in good condition. Now the next thing we'll do is get this out of the way. Just going to grab onto this clamp right here. Now we'll grab onto the locking hub, give it a nice wiggle and remove it from the area. Now behind that area you're going to find a snap ring. We need to go ahead and remove that so we can get the washers and spacers out of the way. Now we're going to make our way over to removing the outer tie rod end from the knuckle. Go ahead and remove your cotter pin and then the nut. Now we're going to separate this joint. Obviously our tie rod end boot is in very poor condition and we're going to replace it anyway, but if yours isn't, be careful not to damage it. Now at this point we can turn this so we can access our 2 caliper bracket bolts. Remove those. Leave that in a little bit. Carefully hang your caliper so it's putting no pressure on your flex hose. Remove your rotor. So now we're going to turn the knuckle so we have a clear view of the back side of it. We want to remove all 4 of our mounting nuts that hold the bearing to the knuckle. Just make sure that you have plenty of slack on your ABS wire. So now we're going to get the bearing off of the knuckle here. To do that, for me, I can just wiggle it around and it's going to come off, but typically that's not the way it's going to be. If you're having an issue, you can just go ahead and take one of your nuts, put it on the back side there onto one of those studs, put it on a couple threads, then take your socket right over it with a nice rubber mallet and give it a bunch of bonks until your bearing comes loose. With that out of the way, let's continue on to grabbing the axle and removing it from the knuckle. If you find that this area inside here is stuck inside the knuckle, you can come from the back side right along here. We're going to gently pry. Remove the axle. Now the next thing we need to do is get the knuckle right out of here. So to do that, we're going to have to remove both of the ball joint nuts at the same time, and then we'll knock this down and out of here. Now if your cotter pin's like mine and it doesn't want to come out of here, we'll just go ahead and break off what we can and then remove the nut. Now the next thing you want to do is go ahead and make sure you spray this down with a lot of penetrant and let it make its way down and in here, because this area right up along the ball joint stud is actually a bushing that we're going to need to lift up and out so we'll be able to get the ball joint out. Now I'm just going to take that upper ball joint nut, I'll start it on there a few good threads, and then we're going to try to get underneath this bushing and lift it up the ball joint stud. So now we have it so the bushing's broken free and it makes it so the ball joint stud is free in the upper area here. Now let's move along to the lower ball joint nut. Remove that as well. Just double check, make sure it's coming up. Yep, looks good. take that one, start it on there a couple threads as well. Remove the nut from the upper ball joint. Make sure you have plenty of movement up here. Now we're going to come down along this lower ball joint and we're going to bonk along the ear of the differential tube. Essentially, I just want to cause some vibration to break this free. Make sure you have your nut on here. That's going to ensure that this doesn't fall down and hurt you. Remove the knuckle from the truck. So now we're going to start working on removing the ball joints from the knuckle itself. You'll notice that the lower ball joint has a snap ring on it. Let's go ahead and remove that. Don't. Now let's remove our grease fitting. Now the next thing I need to do is remove the ball joint from the knuckle. So of course I'm going to need to use my ball joint tools here, a little cup. I'm going to slide it over the stud, and I want to make sure that I have the adapter that has the area for the stud to go through. After that, grab your ball joint press, we'll set it up just like this, and we're going to put the rod up against the center of the ball joint. Alright, so now with it all set up, we're going to be paying attention to this area along here. As we drive this through, we want to make sure that it's actually pushing through. Now let's change out our cups and do the same to the upper ball joint. If you want to, you can remove the grease fitting area here. I'm not going to worry about it. There they are, friends. Now with everything all apart, the next thing I want to do is just clean up this area the best I can. I'm going to scrape off any of these large chunk of rust that I can see here, and of course all this area down along where the ball joint's supposed to be. You want to make sure you have the areas where the ball joint studs are going to go through nice and clean. The next thing I want to clean up is the areas on the knuckle where the ball joint's going to press into, essentially all along this area right here. Do this side, and then we'll do the same for the lower ball joint as well. So now it's going to be time to start installing our brand new ball joints. To install them, what I'm going to need to do is remove the boots from each of them. So to do that, I'm just going to carefully get behind the boot with my screwdriver, and then I'll just pry it away. Set that aside. Do the same to the other one. Let's get ready for our install. To start the installation, we'll start with the upper ball joint, which is the smaller of the two. Take my press. Now I'll take the ball joint. I'll slide it right into where it belongs. Now the next thing we want to do is get a cup that's going to fit over this inner portion right along this outer edge right here. So I'll just use this because I've got it. I'll put on the adapter that has the hole for the stud. Now the next thing I want to do is have a cup on the back side here. I want to make sure that it has a hollowed out area so when this actually comes through, it's going to have some space to come through a little bit further. Put your cup on there and then snug it up. Now we're just going to drive this in so the ball joint's flat up against the knuckle. With the pressure still on it, let's continue on by giving it a couple bonks. That's just going to help settle in the ball joint. Now remove your unit. So now to do the lower ball joint, what you're probably going to notice is you're not going to have very much space for a couple adapters in here. So I'm just going to go with one adapter first. I'm going to bring it so it's level, then I'll stop, continue on by adding another spacer, and then putting it in the rest of the way. Okay, stopped. Okay, it's bottomed out. A couple loving bonks. Now let's go ahead and put our snap ring on here. Make sure it's completely secured. Now it's going to be time to get our boots on here. You want to pay attention to this area right along here. We want to make sure that we have that facing away from where the brakes are going to be. So obviously the brakes are going to be on the other side of the knuckle, so I'm going to have it facing in this direction. I'm going to start on one side just like this, and then I'll use some pliers to grab along this edge and squeeze it down and over. Make sure it's nice and secure. Do the same to the other. Now if you wanted to, you can continue on by removing this bushing completely. Typically you don't necessarily have to do that, but I would recommend using some copper never-sees along this area here. All right, let's get this into the truck. Line up both of your ball joints with the corresponding holes and then slide it up and in. Once you have it in, go ahead and start on your nuts. Okay, we got that started. Let's start by snugging up the lower ball joint first. So now we're going to start tightening up our nuts. When you do this, you want to make sure that you tighten and torque the lower ball joint first, and then we'll move along to doing the upper. If you do the upper first, you're going to have an issue where you press in this bushing right here, and it's going to end up damaging your ball joints. Once it's snug, go ahead and torque this to 150 foot-pounds. Now we're going to move up to the upper ball joint right here. We're going to go ahead and snug this down. You're going to notice the bushing presses down into this area here, and then we'll torque it to 69 foot-pounds. So now the next thing we need to do is make sure that we have our slot on our nut lined up with the hole on the ball joint stud. If it's not, you need to continue tightening until the very next one does. This one's close. I'll just give it a little extra. Put in our cotter pin. Put the cotter pin through and then pin it over so there's no way this nut can loosen up. Now it's going to be time to install our axle. Make sure that this area here that goes into the differential is nice and clean and free of debris. You also want to make sure this area along here is also clean. That's where the seal is going to be. This looks good. Let's install it. Now when you press this in, you want to be very careful not to damage this seal that comes along here. Just wiggle it back and forth. Give it a couple loving bonks with your rubber mallet. Now at this point, what you're going to want to do is remove the backing plate from the bearing. Ours didn't actually have a backing plate on it, so I'm just going to go ahead and put it on. And we're going to slide this down over the studs. Pay attention to this ear right here. You want to make sure you don't damage your ABS wire. I'm just going to take it, give it a light bend, and we can slide this down and over. Use some red thread locker on all of your studs. Something you want to pay attention to is this area along here. You want to make sure that it's nice and clean and free of any debris. Use some sandpaper or a disc or whatever you need to do. Now let's go ahead and get this onto the truck. Be careful for your ABS wire. Make sure it's not going to get a pinch. Now let's turn this and start all four of our nuts. Now let's go ahead and start on all of our nuts and then we'll snug them up and torque them. Once they're all snug, torque them all to 133 foot-pounds. What you're going to notice is where the snap ring is supposed to go on the axle. You want to make sure that that's pushed out this way, out through the bearing. If it doesn't seem like it is far enough, you can use a bar right along the backside and push it through a little further. Right under here. So now let's get this back together. We're going to start with this large one. This one, both the shims, and then of course our snap ring. Ow. Now I'm just going to go along the edge of that and just make sure it's completely inside the groove. Now let's spray some copper never-sees inside this area. Slide in your locking hub. Let's put on our locking clamp. Make sure that it's sitting in the groove all the way around. Now the next thing you're going to want to do is clean up the mating surface on your hub and of course on the back side of the rotor. After you've done that, go ahead and put on a nice coating of copper never-sees. I'm just going to use an oversized nut and the lug nut to hold the rotor still for me. Now let's get our caliper on here. We'll start in both of our caliper bolts using a little bit of red thread locker, and then we'll snug them up and torque them to 166 foot-pounds. Now let's get our outer tie rod end on here. Once again, I know that my tie rod boot is damaged. I'm going to be replacing this in a future date. So let's go ahead and put our nut on here. We'll snug it up and then we'll torque it to 67 foot-pounds. Take your cotter pin, put it in there, and then pin it over so there's no way the nut can loosen up any further than the cotter pin. Now it's going to be time to run our ABS wire. I'm going to come in between this area, put it into here, right up there. We'll bring it across. We want to make sure we secure it in right here on the frame. Connect this in. Give it a nice tug, make sure it's secured, and then put it on the back side here so it's secure. Now let's get this on here as well. Make sure that can pivot. We'll get the wheel on here, start all of our lug nuts, get it back on the ground, and then we'll torque the lug nuts to 165 foot-pounds. Torqued.